So for our second introductory presentation for this colloquium today, we have the great pleasure to be able to welcome Joseph Danan. He is both a university character who has been working a lot on theater and what theater is all about. And he's also a playwright, a writer. So he is interested in both aspects, has experience in both aspects, and we decided that would be interesting. And I'll just let Joseph explain why and how he has not yet written any puppet plays. It's not quite true, you'll see. Anyway, he'll explain all that to you. Thank you, Joseph. Thank you, Digi. And thank you for that introduction. Prologue in the form of an apologue. In the latest play by Pauline Pirade, À la carabine, we can find, instead of a list of characters, this: the weapon, the target. I'm not saying that Pauline Pirade actually wrote for theater, the theater of objects, and which you might understand as a variation on puppet plays. However, naming those two characters, rather than naming those characters by their names or by M and W or he and she gave them a metatomical designation borrowed from the semantics of objects. So what is that play actually about? Well, first of all, a young man and a very young girl who are at a shooting range at a country fair. But the serial construction of this play and that first series of sequences alternates with others, particularly those made up, in fact, of the main theatrical theme of this play, this actual spinal column, and which can be summarized as this: the young girl, in other words, the weapon, aims at the young man, in other words, the target, and says and explains why she's going to punish him for the rape that she was a victim of. That rifle is pointed in the young man's mouth, which reverses the imposed sexual act. And the first words of the play are "suck, bastard." In other words, that which cannot be shown on a theater stage. In fact, we might even say that Pauline Pirade is combining two things that are impossible to show on the stage: a forced fellation and death provoked to another, because that stage direction which closes the play says, she shoved the weapon down his throat, she fires. This central theme of the weapon targeted, aimed at the target, is organized around a series of sequences that are called the mouth, which opens the play and in which we hear "suck, bastard," and then tongue, similarly. We don't know, doesn't indicate who is speaking, but we understand that it's the young woman, and the text is more developed and starts, "You wonder whether this is true. What do you think? What does your tongue say? Lick it. Do you feel that metal? What's it like? Is it hot? And if I put it here, if I put it against your tongue, what does it feel like? Is it burning?" After mouth and tongue, then we have palate, teeth, throat. And the titles of these sequences, so these words that are given as a block of text that are not dissimulated, contribute to depersonalizing the characters, the actors, and by doing so, de-individualizing their story. This lets go of the ties to realism and moves towards a more general dimension, which is both phantasmatic and mythical, and even allegorical. Picasso, quoted by André Breton in the Anthologie de l'humour noir, said, so Picasso said, "Do you think I care that that painting represents two people? Those people existed and no longer exist. Their vision was given to me and created an initial emotion, and little by little, their actual presence disappeared, and they've become a sort of a fiction. And then they disappeared completely, or rather they were transformed into all types of problems." End of quotation. The characters in à la Carabine may have existed. They may not be real, but they are credible. And they dissolve in the writing of the play. If they still exist in a rather realistic format in the shooting range scene, these characters in the following sequences of the whole, they reach a dimension which pulls themselves nearly completely out of realism, the weapon and the target. I said earlier that Pauline Perraud's was not necessarily written for the theater of objects, but I do believe that she puts out a key question to contemporary directing. What are we representing? And therefore, how do we represent it? Or we could reverse things and say, how do we represent things? And therefore, what do we represent? The sequences of the shooting range, which come before the rape, in those sequences, we see the typically masculine, or rather macho, attempts to control the young woman. And there are dialogues, and although the characters are not named, their replies are introduced by dashes, and speakers can be identified easily. These sequences here, as I said, can be easily imagined played by an actor and an actress. But the weapon and the target? The question is stated at the start of the play through this list of characters and cannot be forgotten. It is valid throughout the play, and throughout the play, the question is raised regarding representation. How do you, by creating a gap between this list of characters and that which is represented on the stage, which cannot fill that gap. This question can be, we can establish a link between this question and the third series of sequences. So these sequences are made up of brief staging directions based on an image, an object, in fact. 3 rifle butt, that's the title. Multicolored balloons shake in the cage, concentration. And we might note that the object that is the title, that the rifle butt, creates a sort of a tension between the staging and the object, and another type of tension between the object, the balloons, and the human, or the feeling, like that concentration. Another example, 6, cheek. A pellet hits the back of the cage. Shit. And here the object title is a part of the body. Other examples with various diverse variations on human, not human. Viewfinder. A gold bumper car hits a gray bumper car. Screams of joy. 10, barrel. The pink sugar wraps around a wooden stick. Saliva floods into the mouth. 16, flexor. A red plastic duck turns in circles in a tub. Storm. And 21, temple. A blue rabbit helium balloon gets stuck in a tree, crying. And here the staging directions, whether deliberately or not, quote a shot from Franz Liszt's M, in which a balloon gets caught in telegraph wires, which is a metaphor for the rape and the murder of the little girl. So, you know, with these balloons, that's the metaphor. A lot of contemporary authors, including myself, do not imagine things directly on the stage, not at least when they're writing. They define the representation not as self-evident or natural, but as a question. And that is where the marionette or the object comes into play, in this detachment from naturalism. At least that's how I see it in the contemporary theater writing, at least in its most inventive forms, not as a codified representation of archetypes, which may have existed in the past, but as a lever for imagination. That's the end of the prologue. Preamble, accompanied by a warning. I was very happy to get Didier Placel's proposal to make a presentation at this colloquium, first of our friendship, and then the idea for a Parisian to go to Montpellier in the fall. And it also put me into an abyssal perplexity. As a researcher, I am not particularly competent to talk about puppets, and as an author, because that's why Didier asked me to come, I've never written for puppets. So I accepted his proposal. After all, if we knew what we were going to do ahead of time, what would be the point of doing colloquiums? And in fact, had I really never written for puppets? There was one short play, Sur Terre moins qu'au ciel, which I wrote in 2008, which was done as a call for text, a competition which I couldn't find any trace of. I didn't win, so disappeared. And then that was published in a small literary review. And then I remembered that in one of my plays for children, Le Théâtre des Papas, the Papas Theater, which was written also in 2008 and published in Ayoka Jeunesse, there was a small puppet stand. And as I was very surprised that as I checked my memory, the list started getting longer and longer. Maybe I wrote for puppets without knowing it or without wanting to. I'll come back to some other cases, but first these two plays, Sur la terre moins qu'au ciel and Le Théâtre des Papas. I wanted to start there. So I got started on the work. One more thing I'd like to add. I will not here, as Didier suggested, raise questions as a non-specialist in puppets. These questions, as you will have understood, will come from my own writing, and with the humble hope that I will not be beating a dead horse. End of preamble. So to get back to this presentation, how and why I have not yet written for puppets, or why I haven't written for puppets. And first of all, why insist on affirming that I have never written for puppets? On the one hand, in my production, puppets make just a fleeting appearance, and on the other hand, a short play which I saw as experimental, nearly an accident, for which I was given the opportunity to try something, but then which didn't go any further. For me, writing for puppets means, or at least meant, that the play was entirely written for puppets, because otherwise it would just mean integrating puppets in a dramatic work dominated by humans in flesh and blood. The analogy that I'm going to give is just take it for what it's worth. I was in the same situation as when I was working on my thesis on the transposition of interior monologues in theater. I compared monologues, or interior monologues, which, in other words, the monologue as an entire play, monologues as part of a play. And of course, I was interested in the monologue as an entire work, which that's what I thought was interesting. Otherwise, you could look at Corneille or Beaumarchais or lots of others, and you would see that there are lots and lots of monologues that exist, and even interior monologues. And it seemed to me that writing for puppets meant establishing a world with its own codes. And what was of interest to researchers and authors, whether they be dramatic or theater authors, is the world of puppets, the puppet world. It's very intimidating, and that's why I had never written for puppets except for this little play that I mentioned, because I didn't know this world. It is world, as if you needed to know it in order to invent it, but as if, as I said earlier, and as many contemporaries think, playwriting is a challenge. The weapon, the target, what do you do with that? And why rob myself of that challenge, whereas when I'm always launching challenges? So there was a sort of something implicit, something element, something so obvious. The stage in my own imagination represented humans by humans. And I cannot, when I write a play, I can't get rid of that imagination there, the imagination which I believe I owe to the cinema. For a long time, I projected onto the stage the movies that I did not actually make. And then, in addition, I like actors and actresses. I like their presence, their bodies, the eroticism which circulates between them and the audience. It seemed to me, and I'm speaking in the past tense because this presentation has allowed me to raise some questions, that I would be depriving myself of what was at the heart of my own relationship to theater by excluding those presents. I am aware, and that's why these comments may seem more naive than they actually are, that it's something else is happening with marionettes. A world that has been created and which becomes a substitute for the real world. And that's theater pushed to the extreme. Or perhaps the convention between the illusion or the creative convention of another illusion. And this convention could be seen as the very foundation of theater. This convention which explains and justifies the fact that any play, or nearly, not specifically written for puppets, could be staged with puppets, which is not the point here. But I must, given the project that I've undertaken, take a few words about the only play that I wrote for puppets, and which is part of this metaphorical framework where humans are represented by puppets. Which humans? Well, first of all, a baby who is in the center of the play, and where mom and dad are getting ready to celebrate the first birthday. That's an answer to one question. Why was this short play destined specifically for puppets? A baby who is supposed to say gaga or just when it's his turn to answer cannot really be represented by a real baby on the stage. So the play is cut into very short fragments, like flashes, where there are scenes with the baby which alternate with dialogues with dead people. The dead people are the grandparents, paps and mums. Papa's parents. Mom's just died and tells Paps about the baby, who she didn't know for very long on Earth. So where are they? Somewhere else, or in the same place, in a place without a place, says the staging directions. And it's the introduction to the dialogue. Somewhere else, or in the same place. Anyway, this situation reminded me of puppets, as if playing this dialogue, which is very fragmented, like short scenes, played by actors would seem absurd. It could be played by shadows or by voices, but not represented by living people. And I know that a director could make that choice. It doesn't matter. Here I'm talking about what was inscribed in the writing at the moment that it was written. What's very surprising when I think about it, and I didn't imagine Papa and Mama coexisting with baby puppet. Here it was all about creating a world, but I could give a theatrical direction to that world, as if the world of the dead had sort of overflowed onto the world of the living. And the play ends with a blast of an explosion which destroys just a moment earlier what gave the illusion of life and happiness on the stage. Remember, this is I was thinking of Crescita 12th, which in which the stage is emptied by a blast as well. The epilogue of that play was based on a poem by Mohammed Darwish. At war, there is a hole that's made in our shadow to move from one door to another. And in my preparatory notes, I also found we have to understand in the end that everyone is dead, that these voices are in an empty apartment. I was just talking about what was inscribed in the writing or what was steeped through it. The playwright can not really escape the importance of what Dor calls the models of representation. And I think that as I wrote this, I was thinking of a show which had struck me many years earlier, which had been directed by it was a puppet show of Rockabye by Beckett, directed by Puma Frege, which was a work of his youth. And this question of representation was essential. It seems to me that the playwright must have that in mind to work in order with puppets, not to reproduce it, but to play with it, to move closer or further away. That's why many contemporary puppet plays are written on request for companies who have specific aesthetic requests, which reminds us of yesterday's roundtable. The writing is done in a sort of a coming and going between the stage, which is used as a model, and what the writing itself moves forward and how it modifies the models. I've been writing for 25 years and written many wars that bring war, many plays that bring war into play. But I think I haven't seen enough puppet shows, particularly contemporary texts for marionette puppet shows, which I will do. However, if I look at the inventory of plays that I have written and that use puppets, then there's a different problematic here. First of all, the puppets appear in plays for children, which I understand is a sort of cliche. And as I said, this was represented in the Théâtre des Papas, and which was this short play that I mentioned is not a play for children, and even less so for babies. In the Théâtre des Papas, the papa builds a puppet booth for his baby in which he plays various figures. The play does not specify how the baby is represented or what's happening in the puppet booth. But the problem is not the same on Sur la terre moins qu'au ciel, because the play is written for an actress and an actor on the one hand, and the figures in a puppet booth on the other hand. And so if we must look at how to represent the baby, you may have the baby played by an adult who doesn't appear to go to work with the children, the theater under the watchful eye of children. But the figures that are played by the father go beyond the expectations that you may have from a puppet booth. The second sequence is called The History of Humanity in 80 Seconds. I'm going to read it as the staging. On the stage of the little theater, we see warriors from different periods, knights in shining armor, intergalactic monsters, redskins with bare-skinned redskins, soldiers from the 21st century, cavemen with brontosaurus bones, and the superheroes jump through the air to determine transformer robots. And Papa directs this world, which seems to be completely become independent. It's something between Helzepoppen and Star Wars 1 to 12 combined, and it's there. And Papa gets overworked, and then suddenly there are explosions. The sirens start screaming, and so does the baby. In the third sequence, From Earth to the Moon, which is just the following sequence. Calm is reestablished, that the scene is empty. There's no more baby doing mimicking for his baby, like Papa popping his eyes out, baby cries. Papa pops his eyes out even more, baby cries even, laughs even harder. Papa raises an eyebrow, and Papa scratches his head, and a banana appears. Papa, baby laughs again, etc., etc. And then the banana goes around the Papa's head and ends up in the Papa's eye, and baby is just dying of laughter. Now, I'm not going to go into more detailed analysis of this play. I would just say that what I'm interested in here, as I reread it, was that the theater overflows beyond the puppet booth, at least in the baby's viewpoint, for whom everything is comedy. In another, Sans ma fille, there's a child who invents a shadow theater, and it's a sort of a meta theater. In my other children's plays, the puppet is not used as a puppet. In the Aventure d'Orient and in À la poursuite de l'oiseau du sommeil, both published in École Jeunesse, animals, very often talkative animals, appear. And these plays call on puppets, but also on masks and on costumes. And I know that there's a slight distortion. Here, we were only supposed to talk about plays that were explicitly written for puppets. And in the cinema, there are also parrots who speak, but actually just repeat things. Well, that's something different. So I realized that, with the exception of Sur la terre moins qu'au ciel, what I was interested in really was the appearance of puppets in a universe which is not a puppet universe. In other words, other modes of representation within the theatrical world dominated by representation codes which are, let's say, traditional in the Western world. However, there was one play that I'd like to mention here. This maybe comes back to a question which came up yesterday on the automatons. This play was called Si j'étais un homme, If I Were an Homme, in 2009. And it involves a small humanoid robot, which is one of the main characters in the play. Now, a robot is not a puppet, and I'm not going to open the debate on that subject, which others would be better placed to discuss. But here we're talking more about other modes of representation, because the robot represents a robot, whereas a puppet generally does not represent a puppet. But what I'm interested in here is, how does theater confront humans in what is not human, whether it be animals, objects, robots, machines? Maybe to question the limits of the human. And here, this brings us back phrase when she talked about the way in which to get humans and others to coexist and to create a relationship on the scene. Others for which everyday life and traditional staging generally don't give much more than a status of abject. It's a question of bringing things to life, like for puppets. And a little bit later in her article, she says, this is about highlighting an extraordinary network of relations between the human and the non-human. And she refers to issue number 20 of Puck, Human, Non-Human, coordinated by Cristina Grazioli and Didier Plassard. And here, if I mention the methods that I adopted in this presentation, I noted that I'm looking at my own practice, but I would like to mention that I discovered, contrary to what I thought, that it's more a path of hybridation rather than the creation of a puppet world, which as an author stimulates me. I'm talking personally, of course. Contemporary works of art written for puppets are either one or the other, written specifically for puppets or hybrids, and there's a great variety. And I'd like to give you one example in which the questions are complex and profound. It is a play by Jean Cagnard, who was here with us yesterday. It's called Les Gens Légers, published in 2006, written on commission from the company Archital, and the list of characters is preceded by this following indication. Among the characters of this text for actors and puppets, we may also mention, and then there's a list: man, the father; woman, the mother; man with a hand crank, the son; a little girl, the grandmother; a small pile of ashes. The play also has a serial construction. Starting at the first scene, man and woman are confronted with the small pile of ashes. In other words, that which cannot be presented. I know that this is a bit of a shortcut because it's complex, and that complexity, as I mentioned earlier, could be developed. But in fact, this play plays on what is or can be or cannot be represented. Of course, you can always represent a pile of ashes, but a pile of ashes that speaks. And again, what would that pile of ashes represent? Nothing indicates, in fact, that man and woman are represented by actors. In that list of characters that I just gave you, it just says some are actors and some are puppets, but it doesn't say which. This is true for the entire play, as the characters, whether they be actors or puppets, are confronted with objects that have their own lives. A train, for example, which is a major character in the play, and escapes the horizontality to move towards the sky, or a chimney, or smoke. And as we move through the play, what may have been an erstat for the theater of the absurd, or a childish dream world with for example, the little girl meets a man who turns a hand crank to shrink the sky. As we move through the play, the recurring signs are insist so that to make us look at what is between the lines. The evocation of the Shoah, which is never named, but is suggested by a series of disjointed elements, as if they were haphazardly thrown onto the stage. A series of metaphors, for example, the sky that shrinks, or striped wallpaper. It's a dream world which turns towards a nightmare, and which erases the borders between human and non-human, and moves towards dehumanization, and humans actually are transformed into smoke. One of the crystallizations, one of the most spectacular crystallizations of this world is in the image of the house in which the family lives. It looks like a box with mechanism in which the characters are pushed closer and closer to each other as the walls move closer and closer together. Here's the description of that house. A wall vanishes. A phony door appears in the tapestry and opens. The father appears. At the same time, the top of the buffet swivels and we see a mother in a niche. And then there's the chandelier that drops down and opens a trapdoor in which you can see the head of the boy. Another trapdoor opens in the floor and there's the grandmother. And with lots of care, each of the people comes out of their respective obscurity and sit down at the table. End of quotation. A little further in the play, the house becomes a train car in which they're all piled up together. So Les gens légers, the light people, is of course not a play for children, but a world in which has childlike resonance. Sandrine Le Ponce, for example, also talks about the world under the watchful eye of a child, as if the child's eye enabled us to modify this world. An eye made of surprise, of incomprehension, and terror. Using puppets here is like a detour to represent the unpresentable, much more certainty and much more acceptability than by bringing in a whole cohort of extras in striped pajamas. This is not Schindler's List, but we have seen that sort of thing at the theater. Here, the very evocation of prison wear escapes realism. I'm going to quote again the staging instructions. Here's a wall, which may remind us of another wall, the one in the kitchen, the striped wall in the kitchen, except that this one is completely human. The people who know how to be happy, we've seen that in the past, are so numerous and so closely engaged in the same destiny that they end up by making a wall, unless it's maybe a flag, because it would seem that this population is more destined to the wind than to putting down roots. End of quote. And what is freed up in this work for puppets is a phantasmatic aspect in which the meta theater opens a second play in which the prisoners play with a small puppet theater, in which, in other words, they play, which means that they delegate what life they still have to the puppets. The puppets play this role here. They, as said, as Didier Plansard, he makes the unbearable. He enables us to look at what is the unbearable, to represent what is unpresentable, and to send us towards an aesthetic dimension, which may remind us that this is a form of catharsis, because we have to live, but not forget, move beyond the horror, take the train again. Jean Cagnard's play opens and closes almost on a train trip, a normal trip. Les gens gelés illustrate, along with other contemporary plays, what could be theatrical writing if you do it as a puppet play. I may say it differently. Dramatic playing open to the puppets, just like we may open to video, to performance, to video. Thank you.